Good evening, friends. My name is Matt Green. I'm head of school here at Falmouth Academy, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the fourth installment of Falmouth Academy's Community Series, sponsored in part by the Woods Hole Foundation. Ordinarily, I'd be greeting you with a short video and then step aside to make room for whoever our featured guests and moderators are. But today it's my good fortune to be able to spend the evening with our guest, Mr. Steve Mirsky. Steve Mirsky is a graduate of Lehman College and Cornell University, as well as a longtime writer for Scientific American and the host of that magazine's long form science podcast, Science Talk, and the producer of the daily 60-second science podcast. He has also written Scientific American's monthly column, Anti-Gravity, since 1995. Steve, welcome to Falmouth Academy, and thank you for agreeing to spend some time with us tonight.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. I have fond memories of being in Falmouth.
We're glad you're back, even if it's virtually. I'm going to begin by quoting you because though I've interviewed a number of people over the years, no one has ever suggested that an appropriate opening question would be, who are you and why should anyone care what you think? So Steve, beyond the 2 or 3 lines of biography I've already supplied, who are you and why should anyone care what you think?
Why should anybody care what I think is really, an amazing thing to put forth because I don't have a good answer for it. But I'm delighted to be here and maybe I have some interesting things to share that I'm kind of discounting. And who am I? I'm a nice Jewish boy from the Bronx. My parents were both in the United States Marine Corps and then were blue collar. And then my father became a teacher after being a blue collar worker for many years. And my mom was a secretary. And I was born in 58. I grew up in the 60s and 70s here in New York when it was a much different place than it is now. And I'm really a product of being in New York and being the child of 2 Jewish Marines, which is fairly unusual, I think. And I've had some interesting experiences that maybe give me something interesting to share with you today.
Yeah. Given that your folks were in education, did you ever feel called to be a teacher, or do you see to some degree what you've done in your career as the equivalent of being a teacher?
It's interesting. My dad was a vocational teacher, and I'm really not a handy person. So right. I didn't think of it in those terms. But what I did think was similar was that before he was a carpenter, before he became a carpentry teacher. And I always thought that writing an article sometimes was kind of magical in the same way that he could build a whole house. There was nothing there, and then there was a house there after some time. And when you're researching and writing an article, there's nothing there, and when you're done, there's some kind of a edifice in words that may have a life of its own and may inform some people in interesting ways. So in that sense, I thought there was a little bit of a similarity.
Yeah. I can relate to not being handy. I grew up in campus housing and learned absolutely nothing about how to take care of anything mechanical. And I knew that if something was broken in the house and I needed it fixed, I would call up the maintenance office and say, this is broken. I think I can fix it myself. And they would come running almost immediately. No. Yeah. So how did you become a science writer? Was there a particular mentor or somebody inspire you along the way?
Well, I took one writing class in college, but at that point I really didn't intend to be a science journalist because I was a chemistry major.
Okay.
And I had a really wonderful writing teacher for a semester, Professor Silverman. I wish I could remember her first name. Anyway, so there were assignments and you could pick what you wanted to write about. And one day she said to me, You are like a combination of Stephen Jay Gould and James Joyce.
Wow.
And I said, wow.
High praise.
High praise. And then she said, yeah, you like to write about evolution and you don't know how to punctuate. I took that to heart and tried to learn punctuation, but I always maintained a real fondness for writing about evolution and learning about evolution.
Yeah. Well, I would expect that some of the folks that are in the audience tonight are some of my students, or perhaps some of my teachers. When you think about advice for young writers, what would you offer them? What are some of the challenges? What are some of the joys, or any aspect of your process that might be helpful for them?
I don't think this is anything novel.
Yep.
Excuse me. You got to read everything. Read things that you didn't think you might be interested in. I mean, one of my favorite magazines is The New Yorker, and I've been reading it for a long time. And one of the real joys of The New Yorker to me was always to pick it up and just start looking in the magazine and maybe getting interested in an article about something that you previously didn't realize you might ever be interested in. So read, and then, and the other part is write. Just write. Keep writing. Write a lot. The more you write, the more you'll figure out who you are as a writer. Yeah. And, I discovered that I was kind of a humor writer, even when I wasn't trying. And so, that was an interesting discovery. But I really think that as you write, first you'll copy people that you like. And that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. You'll try out different styles, and eventually you'll figure out who you are and what you have to say. And by reading a lot, you'll be exposed to so many different ways of putting a sentence and a paragraph together. And I'll tell you, some of my real influences. There was a great short story writer named Gene Shepard, who was the person who wrote the short stories that got turned into the now classic Christmas movie, Christmas Story. Yeah. You'll shoot your eye out, kid. Gene Shepard was on the radio here in New York when I was a kid, and he also wrote short stories. And I remember reading his stuff and listening to him on the radio and saying, boy, I would love to do what he does. And I was fortunate enough to, in my own way, sort of emulate him by writing things that were maybe a little on the light side and funny, and then also not radio. I mean, I did work in radio for a little bit, but eventually podcasts came into being, and I really got a chance to do a lot of those for Scientific American. So he was a big influence. I read a lot of Shakespeare. I went to acting school, so I read a lot of Shakespeare. And, I don't write like Shakespeare, but, I learned a lot from reading Shakespeare. And I was also a big fan of Somerset Maugham. What was special about him, I probably couldn't tell you, but I liked his stuff a lot. And my mom once got me a book, a collection of Ernest Hemingway short stories, and her logic was, I know you like Somerset Maugham, so I figured you'd like this, which I didn't quite see the connection. But then again, her theory about, I'm about 5'7", and her theory was that if I played a lot of basketball, I might grow more because so many basketball players are tall. So
there's a lesson in there for writers, to be sure. Right. I've been reading a number of your columns, and your particular gift seems to be to take something and really tell that story in 300 to 500 words. And that's a challenge for me. I just got my feedback form from some of my parents, and they said, I love Mr. Green's weekly blog posts, but they're a little bit wordy. What have you found to be some of the challenges of writing a 300 to 500 word column, as opposed to having kind of limitless canvas as somebody perhaps at the New Yorker might have?
Sure. Well, the older columns that you saw were probably about 450 to 500 words. And then eventually I got a whole page for myself near the back of the magazine.
Nice.
And those ran about 650,
Yeah.
675. And there's a famous line, I'm sorry I sent such a long reply. I didn't have time to make it shorter. And and one of my goals in writing these columns was to make them uneditable, by which I mean they were like a Jenga tower. I
Yeah.
wanted them to be impossible. If you touched one thing, the whole thing would fall apart.
Yeah.
And so I think Elmore Leonard famously said something like, leave out all the boring parts.
Right. Right.
So I
Sure.
just tried to make it absolutely solid, muscular, and if you tried to futz with it at all, it would be very difficult to put it back together. Now that's a bit of an overstatement about my
Sure.
abilities there, but that was my goal.
Yeah. Well, so let's turn our attention to your experience working with practicing scientists and telling their story. You've ended up talking to a number of Nobel laureates, great scientists, doing kind of offbeat and interesting things. Tell us a few stories. What were some of your more memorable experiences?
I've been fortunate enough. I really don't have an exact count
Yep.
of how many Nobel laureates I've had the pleasure of speaking to, but it's got to be more than 24, and it's really amazing just how pleasant they tend to be for the most part, and how generous with their time they are. I mean, it was helpful to be able to call somebody and say, I'm with Scientific American, just like
Sure.
if you say I'm with the New York Times, they're going to answer the phone. But I think a lot of them would talk to pretty much anybody who was working on something that might be important to people. So I'll give you just some quick recollections. Some of the really old researchers that I got to spend time with were really inspiring. The late Christian de Duve, he was so old when I spoke to him. This was about 2007, maybe 2008. I'll have to look up. He was at least 90 when I spoke to him, and he had won. This is how old he was. He had won the Nobel Prize for discovering organelles.
Oh,
These are
geez.
these little entities within cells. And you always think of organelles as something that people were still discovering in the 19th century.
I feel like I studied organelles in 10th grade biology in 1982.
And you did. And you did, but he discovered the last ones. I forget exactly when.
I love it. Yep.
Sometime in the 30s or 40s.
Yep. Sure.
And I was fortunate enough to be sent by Scientific American to Germany for the Lindau Nobel Prize meeting. So there were at least a dozen Nobel Prize winners there who were there to speak to students, older students, graduate students, postdocs, some undergrads probably. And so he was there, and I got to talk to him about his work, and just a charming, delightful guy. I got to speak with Ernst Mayr, who was at the American Museum of Natural History here in New York, and then I think he was associated with Harvard. There was a 100th birthday symposium for Ernst Mayr at Harvard. And I went to that, and then I got to interview him a couple of weeks later. And he had trained as an ornithologist and was in charge of the Rothschild ornithology collection at the Museum of Natural History here in New York. But he was also renowned as, possibly the greatest evolutionary biologist of the 20th century, if not the greatest, certainly in the conversation. And also just, at the age of 100, a delightful guy. He lived to be 100 and about 6 or 7 months.
Wow.
I remember a little kernel of wisdom from him to think about your keeping active. He had a goal of walking for an hour every day.
Yep.
So when he was 30, that might be 4 miles. And when he was 100, it might be to the mailbox and back. But whatever an hour was,
Yeah.
that's what he did. And just spending time with him was delightful. And then there's a photograph we can put up of Norman Borlaug, who also, when I met him, was at least 90. But Norman Borlaug won a Nobel Peace Prize, even though he was a scientist, because he developed a lot of the ways to improve the nutritional value of crops. And so what was called the Green Revolution was, a lot of that was attributed to Norman Borlaug. And I was fortunate to, I was on a night fellowship at MIT, and we went to Mexico to this agricultural institute that he was affiliated with, and he was there. And I took a photograph of him in front of a big wall photograph of him as a much younger guy, 50 years earlier,
right,
45 years earlier. So that's Norman Borlaug. And also, this is a Nobel laureate, not as old as the other ones, Peter Agre. And a good story about him was when he won the Nobel Prize. I met him in Lindau as well. When he won the Nobel Prize, his mother said to him, don't let this go to your head. And then he did some research that eventually, I don't remember his exact research, but it found some kind of usage in cosmetics, I believe. And his mother said, well, you finally did something useful after the Nobel. So there's a lot of stories like that. And then there are stories. Here's a story about how challenging it was for a lot of people. Berta Scharrer was a researcher who came from Germany. She and her husband, Ernst Scharrer, fled Germany. They were not Jews, but they saw what was going on and they wanted out. And they came to the US, and Ernst got a job, I believe it was a university, either the University of Colorado or somewhere in Colorado. And Berta, back then they weren't giving professorships to women.
Right.
So, but they gave her a lab and she could do what she wanted. And the two of them invented or created a field called psychoneuroimmunology.
Wow.
Or psychoneuro, was it immunology or field dealing with hormones? The word escapes me at the moment. But anyway, so she studied the cockroach. This was her model organism. And she used the American cockroach in her studies. Now, the American cockroach is like really big. It's like this big.
I've seen them on my kitchen floor.
Well, what you're seeing are German cockroaches.
Oh, okay.
They're only this big.
I've never known that.
Okay, so American cockroaches are much bigger. And just to show you what she had to go through, so she's got her lab. She's not being paid, but she's doing her research. And there is a cockroach infestation at the school. And the other professors are blaming her. He said, your organisms got loose.
Sure.
And she says, the organisms that are infesting this building are a different species. How could they be mine? But they just wanted to blame her because they didn't want a woman working among them.
Oh, my.
And eventually they both came over when the Albert Einstein College of Medicine was founded here in the Bronx, not far from where I live. In 1955, they came over and both of them had full professorships. And I met her in the late 80s when I wrote about her. I was working at the Einstein Medical School in the communications office back then, and I wrote a short biography of her for our publication. And she was just an amazing person. And when you think about the hardships that they went through, just that cockroach example always comes back to me. Just how people will find a way to make sure you don't get ahead if they don't like you for whatever reason. Yeah, and then there's a photograph you can put up just to show you how lucky we are. Some of us, when I was working at Scientific American, and the kind of people who just come through Scientific American. There's a photograph of Francis Collins, who just came over one day to chat with the editorial board there. So that's Francis Collins, he's quite the survivor. He's still the director of the NIH, and how he's able to hang on from one administration to the next is pretty amazing. But so we were very fortunate. We get these really big name people who are in a they're not there because they don't deserve to be. Most of them really know what they're doing, and so we get to meet them and talk to them, and it's great.
So obviously Nobel laureates and career scientists, but some unusual people you've met along the way too. Tell me about the turkey and the sock.
Right. So this researcher, Buchholz was his last name. I wrote about this a long time ago. I would scan the stacks. Back then, the internet wasn't what it is today, and I would actually go in and find articles that probably weren't being seen by a whole lot of people deep in what was called the stacks. I guess it's still the stacks, but people don't visit the stacks. So I found this piece about Buchholz, and he wanted to know, it had been assumed that the turkey's bald head was a mating signal to the male turkey's bald head was a mating signal to females. And he was wondering if it might not also have something to do with thermoregulation. And so he got some turkeys, and then he wanted to test them and determine if not having feathers made a big difference in their ability to thermoregulate. Well, where are you going to find a turkey that has feathers for you to compare that to other turkey to? Well, because they don't exist. So he got some frozen rooster heads, figuring that's comparable, and he studied their the way they lost heat, and then he shaved the rooster heads and replaced the missing feathers there with. He went to Walmart and got crew socks, and he replaced their feathers with crew socks on their heads until he found the right set of socks that gave you the same results as before he shaved off all their feathers. And then he put the crew socks on the turkeys. So he's testing the turkeys to see how well they function in various temperature conditions. And he found out that at cold temperatures or medium temperatures, it didn't make any difference. But at high temperatures, and turkeys live, as far south as Mexico, the same species of turkeys that are here in the U.S. live in Mexico, where it can be 102 degrees. And he found out that if they had the feathers in the guise of these crew socks, that their metabolic functioning became really disturbed. They had a very tough time dealing with the heat, basically. And so that was his finding. And so, it's kind of decent evidence that having a bald head, if you're a turkey, is good for thermoregulation and may have been part of why the bald-headed turkeys evolved. So now, who cares?
That's
right?
You anticipated my question.
Who cares? I mean, it's kind of fun. It's kind of funny. But the thing that I always liked about that story was the particular finding may not be important, but the idea behind trying to get the answer is important. He didn't take it for granted that what the theory was. The hypothesis was the bald heads are there as a something to attract females, and that was pretty much accepted. But he said, "No, I don't want to accept that without evidence. I want to find some evidence that either confirms or adds to And so he put this whole project together with the socks to try to get some data to look at and maybe add to the understanding of why those turkeys had evolved the bald head like that. And so to me, that was the really interesting thing, that he didn't just accept what was put out by other people by conjecture. He actually worked up a research project, got some data, and came up with a new hypothesis about why that evolution happened. And, I just think stuff like that is fascinating. And if it's a little offbeat and funny, even better. And it also shows, scientists are human beings. They'll do things that maybe are a little kooky.
I also had fun reading about the moose and the scientist in the suit. Can you tell us more about that one?
Sure. Joel Berger is with the Wildlife Conservation Society, and he's affiliated with some university out west. And he wanted to study moose behavior, specifically how is their behavior changing because of the disappearance of the animals that were predators of moose, like wolves and grizzly bears. Moose, right? Wolves, grizzly bears in the lower 48, because there was about 100-year period there where there weren't a lot of weren't a lot of wolves attacking moose, and so it seemed like they were becoming much more willing to hang around and not flee when a dangerous predator might come along, because they weren't seeing any dangers.
Mm-hmm.
Compared with populations up in Alaska, where the moose were still pretty skittish when it came to the presence of predators. And one of the big clues for the moose was the aroma of the feces of their predators. So he wanted to get close enough to put wolf feces near the moose and gauge their reactions to see if these spoiled brat moose in the lower 48 would still react to it, or would they run away right away? Like, was that genetic programming still in place, or was it some kind of behavior that had been unlearned either through experience or genetically? So he couldn't get close enough to get any kind of reactions. He tried throwing. He said, "I played some ball in college," so he tried throwing the scat, the wolf scat, but he couldn't get it close enough. And then he tried a slingshot approach, but he said that the feces got really disarticulated.
You'd really have to pack it, I suppose. Mm-hmm.
So he decided, along with his then wife, to get into a moose suit. And I was fortunate enough to meet him and see his the top of the moose suit, the head, and he and his wife would get into this moose suit, like from some Abbott and Costello movie, where they're dressed
the
up
horse, yeah,
exactly, and then they would just kind of saunter over to where the moose were and drop the feces and then saunter away again. And moose are really dangerous. This was a dangerous thing to do, because they weigh 1,000 pounds, and if they charge you, it could be fatal. He did recount a time when a moose looked like it was about to charge them, and they were in very deep snow. They couldn't run away, and so they came up with a solution to the problem. They just stood up and threw off the moose suit, which, according to his telling of the story, completely befuddled the angry moose, who just kind of, I don't know what's going on here. And
existential crisis for our friend the moose.
So he just took off. But I always love that story, because it just goes to show you the lengths to which these researchers will go to get their data. And the last I heard from him was a couple of years ago. He was now dressing as a polar bear, study the behavior of musk oxen, because polar bears, I think the reason was, didn't used to predate upon musk oxen so much, but they were starting to. So we wanted to see if the musk oxen had a different reaction to polar bears than they used to.
So he's really cornered the market on animal disguise research.
Actually, he did tell me about somebody who would study zebras by putting on a zebra poncho and wandering through the zebra herd, and I think that might have been his inspiration.
Oh my!
For the initial moose suit about 20 years ago.
So I'll bring it over to kind of science education and the lessons you learned on your trip to the Grand Canyon with the National Center for Science Education. Obviously, our school has got a long tradition of science education, science fair, and I know that trip sparked some passion in you about how we're teaching science.
Yeah, definitely. I had this passion earlier. Actually, I've been writing about science, evolution education in public schools, at least since the late '80s, and then I had this opportunity with the NCSE, National Center for Science Education. They do a rafting trip through the Grand Canyon. They did anyway this past year. It had to have been canceled. Where there's a geologist and an evolutionary biologist who go along on the trip, and they show you things in the canyon from the point of view of our scientific understanding. And then they also talk about the fact that there are many trips that are religious, creationist run trips, and they tell you what those people are told as you're rafting through the canyon. And it's really a fascinating comparison. The canyon is used by creationists as a real example of the effect of the biblical flood. And the reality is that the canyon was formed, relatively recently, but about 5 to 6 million years ago, whereas the creationists tell you that the canyon was formed during the flood about 4,400 years ago. And there are aspects of the canyon that they have their own explanations for. We actually heard somebody when we were in the canyon. There's a gigantic cavern that we stopped in. There were multiple groups because our group was about 25 people, and there are rafting trips going down the river all day, and a bunch of other people had pulled over at about the same time, and one of them was from one of these groups, and we overheard a guy say that the smaller fish were the result of the Lord chopping up bigger fish, and that's why there were bigger fish and smaller fish. And we didn't go over to say anything. It was just a fascinating thing to hear that kind of thing on our trip, which was supposed to be based in, we hope it is based in the latest real understanding. And there's a photograph that you can put up of a fellow, he was the evolutionary biologist on the trip, a fellow named Josh Rosenow, who has his hand on this seam, the Great Unconformity, I think it's called. And that seam represents about a 1.25 billion years of missing material. It's about a quarter of the entire history of the planet, where mountain ranges rose and fall, and untold gazillions of organisms lived and died, and it's just gone.
Right.
It didn't, there wasn't a sedimentation that was permanent like there is below it and then above it is the more recent few billion years. And so it's just amazing to think that you can put your hand there, and there's 1.25 billion missing years in that aren't there in that line. And it's kind of, I don't think our brains can really deal with that. I don't think you can appreciate it. All you can do is kind of hope to think about it and get a tiny feel for how that is. But with our puny lifespans, I don't think we can really understand even what 1,000 years is like, let alone a million or a billion.
I got a letter 10 years or so ago from an alumnus of my school, and it was a long letter critiquing the fact that we were teaching evolution and that he would not give a dime to the school until until we came to our senses. And just one, but I know that you've been on the front lines of the intelligent design argument in schools. I don't know if what the status is of that these days, but I know that's been a subject that you've studied pretty carefully.
Yeah, I was also fortunate enough to cover there's a now famous trial in 2005, Kitzmiller versus the Dover School Board in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where they were trying to get evolution, trying to get intelligent design, which is just gussied up creationism, taught in the public schools. The issue here is public schools, because public schools are subject to the First Amendment. And the First Amendment says you can't establish religion. And the argument that the intelligent design people try to make is that it's not religion, it's science. But in a really incredibly well-written decision by Judge John Jones in that Eastern District of Pennsylvania case, he was appointed by George W. Bush. He's a conservative Republican, but his decision was, this is bunk. You people, this intelligent design stuff is garbage, and you cannot teach it in public schools. In a private school, you can teach anything you want, but you can't teach it in the public schools. And I was there for opening arguments and the first few witnesses. The trial went on for 6 weeks, so I couldn't live there for the whole trial as much as I would have liked to. But from what I saw, let me put it to you this way. If it had been a prize fight, they would have stopped it in the first round, right? It would have been a technical knockout.
Yeah.
The intelligence design people were just getting murdered.
Right.
There's a really terrific evolutionary biologist named Ken Miller, who's at Brown University. And he was one of the key witnesses who debunked intelligent design. Intelligent design basically says things like there are things you find in nature that are too complicated to have evolved.
Right.
And Ken Miller just showed very clearly that that was not true for the particular examples that were being brought up, like the tail, the whip-like tail on a bacterium, the flagellum. So he shows how, no, there are parts of that had their own roles that then got co-opted into the evolution of the flagellum. So it's not that it was just, boom, created. And so he was a terrific witness and just really creamed them.
Are you concerned about the scientific literacy of our populace? Is it how high on the worry meter does that fall for you these days?
I think it's a kind of a preference. I really wish people were more scientifically aware, because I think it's so much fun and so beautiful. But we're seeing now with COVID just how important some level of science literacy is, where you have people who are just believing these crazy things about vaccines, or I mean, that's been around for a while, or about COVID itself. I think one of the things that better science literacy would do would show people how much science cannot do. There are people who believe that, we can make all these bioengineered organisms and all kinds of, ways to impact. I know people who believe that there are weather machines that control the weather
Right.
around the world.
Right.
And so these people have a really amazing faith in the ability of science to do so much. And I think better science literacy would show them that science can do a lot, but
Yeah.
there's a lot it really cannot do.
I wonder if this statement of yours is related, right? It's in your final anti-gravity column, and you said if you think you can create your own reality, real reality will come back to bite you in the ass. What did you mean by that?
I think we saw it over the last year.
Yeah.
How many times were we told things in the hopes that they would be true, or maybe even in the belief that if a certain person said it, it would become the truth? We have about 15 cases. Pretty soon they'll be down to 0. The virus is going to go away once the weather turns warm. The cases are they're not real. There's something else going on. No, you have to deal with the actual situation. You have to be willing to look the situation in the face and deal with it, because you can change a situation, but reality is reality. And if you don't deal with reality, it will bite you in the ass. It always does. And what we saw in the last year was people who were trying not to deal with reality. And what do we have now? The situation is as bad as it ever was during this entire year. So much wasted time because people were not dealing with reality. And now we have a whole country that's been bitten in the ass.
So if I bring it back to Falmouth Academy, what's a school to do? What's a young student, a young idealistic, ambitious student to do? In a few words, where should we be heading right now?
I'm not an educator, and so, but just off the top of my head, just don't be afraid to confront ideas that you're unfamiliar with or uncomfortable with. I mean, I'm on Twitter a lot, and I follow a few people who have completely different ideas than I do, because I want to see what they're thinking, and I want to be challenged. If they have an idea that I hadn't considered or had discarded after looking at it briefly, that then maybe shows me that I'm thinking about something in the wrong way. I'm thrilled to see that. I'm not interested in being in my silo. I'm always happy to look at new ideas, as long as there's something legitimate about them. Read everything and then you can make up your own mind. But it's an old line: have an open mind, but not so open that your brains fall out.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground. Just a couple more questions. I bring things closer to home. You have ties to Falmouth. Tell us a little bit about your ties to Falmouth and what memories you have of our neck of the woods.
Well, I was supposed to spend a week in Falmouth this past summer at a big family reunion, but unfortunately that got wiped away. I spent a few weeks at different times at the Marine Bio Lab at Woods Hole, and I'm a cyclist, so I would cycle over to Falmouth a lot.
Yeah.
Along the I always want to call it, what's it called?
The Shining Sea Bikeway or bike
right,
path.
the Shining Sea. there was a terrorist group in South America called, I think, Shining Path, and I would always
very different.
I would confuse the names, but I would bicycle a lot on the Shining Sea Path there, and go to Falmouth and have grab a bite and just wander around Falmouth, and I thought it was great. You're at the sea. There are great restaurants, and I just make sure not to have this on.
Well, you've given us a lot today, so we're going to have to forgive you this one small transgression. We'd ordinarily be doing this on the stage of the Herman Theater, right in the Simon Center for the Arts, and I was
hoping to do it there.
Well, exactly. So next time, to be sure. But I just come back to your theater roots. I mean, you considered a career in acting at one time. Do you still have that bug? Any plans to scratch that itch? What role has that particular kind of career possibility and had in the rest of your journey?
Well, one thing it did was make me very comfortable to be on stage or to be in front of a microphone or in front of a camera.
Yeah.
And that's just such a terrific thing to have. Especially now when we're all in front of cameras and microphones all the time. But I acted a little bit. I spent a summer in a Shakespeare company in North Carolina, and I did a couple of awful off-Broadway shows. And then I went to college and wound up becoming really interested in chemistry, and went to grad school, and I wound up moving out of chemistry because I saw this fellowship being offered by the American Academy, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. I went to the American Academy of Dramatic Arts to do science journalism. So that's how I moved out of science and became a science journalist. But years later, when I was working at the Einstein Medical School, there was a little theater club there, and that was for students. But I met some of the students somehow, and they asked me if I would direct a play, and so I did. And then there was an opportunity to act in a play there, and so I did. It was a Christopher Durang play. No, that was the one that I directed, Baby with the Bathwater. The one that I acted in was a Harold Pinter play, which was terrifying because the dialogue has these fugue-like portions where, if you mess up the dialogue, you can't just get it back. You might wind up 2 minutes earlier in the show. So I did a few performances of The Dumbwaiter. That was the name of the play. And I enjoyed it, but it also convinced me that I had no real need to do that. So I'm very satisfied with the way things worked out. And, and because of podcasts, when podcasts were invented, it gave me an opportunity to get in front of a microphone in a different way. It's not a theatrical performance, but the other thing I discovered was I was much more at ease in front of an audience as myself. I would have terrible stage fright when I was in a character, but as myself, falling off a log because you can't do anything wrong. You're just yourself.
I've heard the opposite. So, gosh, well, we're glad that you didn't catch that acting bug, because we've gotten a chance to enjoy you throughout the years, and certainly this evening. Steve Mirsky, on behalf of Falmouth Academy and the Community Series, I want to thank you for joining us this evening.
My pleasure.
We will get together at some future date and go watch the Commodores, and we'll root for the same team. Best of luck to you.
I hope so. Take care.